We are back, and we are joined now by Dr. Genevieve Guenther, founding director of endclimatescience.org, affiliate faculty at the Tishman Environment and Design Center at the New School, and author of The Language of Climate Politics, Fossil Fuel Propaganda, and How to Fight It. Thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, we're all seeing what's happening in Houston, the increase in these horrific weather events that are just going to ramp up as climate change continues to make itself, the effects of it on the rest of the population. It'll just continue to increase. And I think a lot of us are feeling quite disempowered. Your book does give a roadmap, though, to feeling more empowered, which I really appreciated. But let's, I guess, start here. We can, I think, easily identify the most insane climate change denial, Trump saying it's a Chinese hoax or whatever. But there are more quotidian, pernicious, subtle forms of denial that I hadn't really considered until I read your book. Let's start there. What are some of those forms that you identified?
Sure. Again, thanks for having me on. Let me just start by saying that, yes, the impacts of global heating are going to continue to get worse, but only until we stop using coal, oil, and gas and create an economy that just puts out net zero emissions. So we stop adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. Once we do that, global warming will halt, and essentially the climate will stabilize into a new normal, and we'll be able to adapt to the extreme weather we have then. The problem is that right now we're not phasing out coal, oil, and gas. We're still developing them. American banks, American oil and gas companies, petrostates around the world are pouring money into new fossil fuel extraction, and this is going exactly in the opposite direction. So what my book does, it talks about this new climate denial, where everyone sort of acknowledges that climate change is real, aside from the really crazy MAGA people who are still calling it a hoax, even as like the very seat of the fossil fuel industry is underwater. Most people, even like the Saudis, for example, acknowledge that climate change is real and that we have to do something about it. But they're advancing a new climate denial, which says we can keep using fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas, and still halt global heating anyway. So this is the narrative. You may have heard it on the news media, from your friends and family, just sort of circulating around in public discourse. It goes something like this. So yes, climate change is real, but to say that it's a danger to our children, the people who are living in our homes already today, is just, quote, alarmist. And anyway, it'll, quote, cost too much to phase out coal, oil, and gas. So the best thing to do is just like rev up our economy and go for more economic, quote, growth, because wealthy people don't suffer the climate impacts as much as poor people do. And anyway, what we can do instead of phasing out fossil fuels is increase innovation and increase resilience. And anyway, we don't want to do anything in the United States because emissions are still rising in, quote, India and China. So what my book does, it takes these terms, these 6 terms in that narrative, and chapter by chapter kind of dismantles them, shows how they're used as fossil fuel propaganda, and offers readers new terms, a new vocabulary, new strategies for talking about the climate crisis that can overcome that new climate denial and really get fossil fuels out of our system in time to create a livable future.
So I guess that's a great framework, I think, for us to talk about some of the myths and the language that does so much work for climate denial. I don't understand how in one breath we can have, people who are meteorologists or people that work on television say a few times a year that this is a once in a lifetime weather event, because just by that time frame, it's quite easy to dispel.
Right.
Those are some things that you discuss as well. But what's behind the effort to downplay it or to dismiss people as alarmists when talking about climate change?
I mean, the truth is, once we phase out coal, oil, and gas. And we have created an economy that runs essentially on clean, safe, new energy sources: solar, sunlight, wind, hydropowder, nuclear, geothermal, all the things that we can do to empower our economies, heat our homes, get us around without burning dead dinosaurs. Once that kind of economy is created, literally 90% of the people on this planet are going to be better off, because their electricity costs are going to go down, their heating and cooling costs at home are going to go down, their transportation costs are going to go down, I mean, like practically to zero, and everyone's healthcare costs are going to go down, because right now fossil fuels are so toxic and are putting so much air pollution into our atmosphere that, you know, phasing them out in the United States alone, this research from the Stanford economist Drew Shindle has shown, phasing them out in the United States alone would give us a healthcare savings of $700 billion a year. A year. So 90% of the people on this planet are going to be better off financially, healthier and wealthier, and we can all like exhale and know all the efforts we're making to like make sure our kids do their homework and like, you know, eat their vegetables and go to bed early are not going to be wasted, because they will actually have a livable future. The problem is that the 1% and fossil fuel interests and everyone who holds fossil fuel stocks are going to lose some money, right? So the IPCC has said that right now, existing fossil fuel infrastructure is projected to emit the total carbon budget for pathways of halting global heating at 2 degrees Celsius, which is the target of the Paris Agreement, with like a 67% or greater likelihood. So that means all the fossil fuels we already have built are going to get us over the 2C target. So they're going to have to be retired before the end of their life. So basically, people own this stuff that should be now worthless, and they don't want to lose money. So basically what's happening is they're willing to trash the only planet that we know supports life in like the whole known universe, ruin my kids' future, you know, the futures of all the kids on this planet. Already, you know, many kids in the global south have died and are suffering greatly from the effects of global heating, just so they can continue to make a little more money for another decade or two. I think it's absolutely disgusting.
I mean, I think so. And it just underscores, I know that Bill McKibben wrote a blurb for your book and is one of our greatest living activists, and he was just arrested outside of one of the major investment banks in New York. People are like, oh, why protest here? Why not protest ExxonMobil? No, it's the holders of the investments in those financial institutions. I mean, I'm sorry, in those oil and gas companies that are really holding the power here, because we see that Exxon's attempting to diversify to a degree and invest in other things, or try to say like, oh, we're looking into this technology or whatever. They understand that without big banks and financiers, their entire model is going to collapse, and that's what's really seemingly the barrier here. Mm-hmm.
Let me stop you right there, and I hope you will forgive me for this.
Sure.
But when you said that Exxon is investing in new technologies and trying to diversify its portfolio, that's actually chapter 5 of my book on innovation.
Okay.
They're saying they're doing that. And
no, you need to correct me. This is why you're here. This is why you're here. Keep going.
This is why fossil fuel propaganda is so pernicious.
Right.
Because Exxon is saying that they're doing that, and they're placing ads in like totally legit publications like the New York Times, proclaiming that they're doing all this research into alternative sources of energy. They're, you know, pouring money into research at universities. They look like they're trying. This is all part of their PR strategy. All of that money is part of their PR budget. But if you look at their total capital expenditure, they're only spending like maybe 1 to 4%, depending on the year, on alternative sources of energy. And those sources are very often bioenergy, which is basically just burning garbage. It's not actually innovating new things that are clean. So we all see these ads, we all hear the rhetoric from these oil and gas companies, and we think, okay, well, at least they're trying. They know they're going to have to diversify. No, this is just them trying to make us trust them, trying to paint themselves as not sociopaths who are happy to burn the planet to a crisp for money, but as like legitimate actors in a democracy. But you know what? They're really, really, really not. And the day that everyone realizes how dangerous coal, oil, and gas is to us and our children, and how essentially evil these people are, because they're also not only not investing in clean energy, they're also pouring money into lobbying against any policy to be passed by a government that would in fact support clean energy or in any way threaten fossil fuels. So they are doing everything they can to try to block the phase out of coal, oil, and gas and block the creation of a net zero economy.
How does carbon capture play into this? That's another technology that these companies tout, but is also an effort for or a focus of their lobbying efforts, even though largely from my understanding, it's complete BS.
That's 100% correct. That's chapter 5. So chapter 5 is on the term innovation, and in climate discourse, innovation is code for carbon capture and carbon dioxide removal. So carbon capture is a technology that supposedly can sort of capture or grab emissions at the source where they're created. So like you stick a machine on a smokestack, for example, and supposedly it can suck up the carbon that is released when you like burn coal or whatever, and then you can send it through a pipeline and bury it on the ground. So oil and gas companies have been trying to get this technology, or have been claiming that they've been trying to get this technology in place for maybe 20 years now. And they've indeed gotten subsidies from the US government, which have been increased with every administration, Republican or Democratic. And to this day, they have never been able to capture even a majority of their targets. And their targets aren't even 100% of emissions. Their targets are like 85 or 90%. And they've only been capturing about 30%. And ironically, the process takes so much energy that very often when they try to establish it, they have to build a separate methane gas plant just to power the carbon capture, which means the whole kit and caboodle systemically is actually adding more emissions to the atmosphere. So that's carbon capture. It's total BS. It's one of these ways that, you know, these oil and gas companies manage to stay at the policymaking table with policymakers, because policymakers would love to be able to just stick a machine on fossil fuel power plants and be done with it. Like, they don't want the political struggle. So there's this way in which they're taking advantage of policymakers, you know, cowardice and credulity. And then the other problem with carbon dioxide removal is that it's actually really hard to break something after it's been, to put something back together that's already been broken. So, you know, it takes literally twice as much energy, or perhaps even more, to take the carbon out of the atmosphere than it did to put it there to begin with. So, for example, to take 1 million tons of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which is only about 15 minutes of the whole year's emissions, you have to put solar panels on about somewhere around 2,000 acres, which is about 1,500 football fields worth of land, just to remove 15 minutes of emissions using clean energy. But the problem is the technologies don't only use clean energy because there's a lot of heat involved in the process. So these technologies too are modeled using methane gas, which means that they're also adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So we need carbon dioxide removal eventually for a net zero economy, because things like agriculture and construction do also put emissions into the atmosphere. But this is going to be like a technology that we're going to use around the margins. for those emissions, they're not something that can keep the fossil fuel system going. And this is what oil and gas is promising, that not only can these technologies keep like decarbonize oil, supposedly, they are the companies who are going to deliver this to the world because they're the ones with this kind of expertise. This is all complete BS. And everybody should be aware that it's BS. And anytime you see it in, advertising or on a website, or you read a journalist repeat this messaging, or a policymaker says it, know that they're lying to you, and that the truth is we have to stop using coal, oil, and gas almost entirely.
And the almost, we've got this covered element of it. It's demobilizing because no one seems to be able to articulate the urgency in a way that isn't just being told as a tragedy, which I know
Right.
you've talked about, the passivity of it, the demobilizing nature in which people will recognize that it's happening, as opposed to saying, well, here's what can be done to do that. I think in part it's the fact that this country has since, I don't know, for decades, really hollowed out its core of what advocacy looks like, and when or what activism looks like when you're putting pressure on capitalist institutions. Like, a lot of it's through market-based choices, and very much less through, hey, can the Democratic Party actually take a hand in the market and force these companies? And, in my ideal world, we'd nationalize our oil and gas and then phase it out. But we're so far away from that conversation that I think the fact that we don't have enough of a society where political institutions are responsive to this, and we just hand it over to the consultant class, that is at the real root of a lot of the rot that you describe.
I completely agree with you. And, part of the tragedy, if there is a tragedy anywhere, it's the tragedy of the neoliberal era, which has hollowed out the relationship between the citizen and the government, the democratic government that's supposed to represent them. And it has individualized and privatized absolutely everything. So especially with young people who are, in their 20s or even in their early 30s, who grew up in this era, they have no idea that actually you can, if you create a collectivity that speaks with a unified voice and doesn't let up, you actually can create change. And so political leaders like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are so important because they are articulating this vision of a new engagement for young people and for working class people and people of color across the United States. But the problem is, as we know, many elites in the Democratic Party are not getting out of the way for those new voices to actually take the lead.
What could you be talking about?
But the other issue is too, part of what my book says is that it's not just the sort of evil right-wing people who are circulating these messages, right? The mainstream and even some people on the left sort of give a permission structure for this. So sometimes the climate crisis is represented as a problem of technology. If we just can develop the right technology, then, as you were suggesting, the market can kind of take over. And because clean energy is cheaper, then by definition, there's going to be a greater demand for it. And we see that this is not true because, solar has been cheaper than fossil fuels for years now, but the market is not free and fossil fuels are subsidized. And all of these things have a cost outlay that needs to be made public. It needs to be socialized and turned into a huge public works project that will, in fact, create a new burst of economic growth and lots of things that we want anyway. Right. So the point is that, there is a discourse about the climate crisis that it's either, an expression of human nature, right? As a woman, I can tell you right now, there is no such thing as human nature, because usually definitions of human nature only include how white men think, but actually there is a huge diversity of human experience. So it's not human nature, it's not technology, it's not, simply right-wing partisanship. It's this kind of hollowing out of the political. as a form of power that is actually available to everybody in a democracy, which is why I think actually authoritarianism is so threatening right now, because people don't realize they already, right this moment, have the power to stop it. Because today we are still a democracy and we can pass policies that will make our lives better. You know, even just calling your policymaker, your elected official once a week, like literally just put it on your calendar once a week, call your senators and your congressperson. And then if you're really serious, you can do it on the state level too. But at least your senators and your congressperson say, hi, my name is, I am in your state or in your district, and I want you to pass policies that will phase out fossil fuels. And I am going to not vote for you if you don't do that. It literally takes like 4 minutes, 3 minutes once a week. And if everyone does that, I guarantee that within some months, we're going to have some discussion about passing robust climate policy.
Yeah, I hear you on that. It is fascinating to see that because of the incentive structure you describe, it feels like many elected Democrats are much more interested in maintaining wealth that already has been accrued versus actual growth, because we know that a Green New Deal style system that you talk about with AOC would provide like a resiliency to our economy, an upgrade, new growth for everybody involved, except for the people that currently hold significant positions in fossil fuel providers. It's just that's what's, when we talk about growth in the economy, I think that is what's often missed, even if you want to put it in purely capitalistic terms.
You know, I have nothing to add to that. Completely agree.
All right. Well, it was a little more spicy when you were correcting me on my accidental climate denial speak, but I really appreciate it. Dr. Genevieve Guenther, the book is in link to it in the description below. It's called The Language of Climate Politics, Fossil Fuel Propaganda, and How to Fight It. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.